to Resilience, a community conversation with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their families, and we're going to be speaking about adverse childhood experiences. And I'm Eileen Hurley. I'm the chairperson for the New Jersey Family Support Planning Council at the statewide level. And so we were formed in accordance with the 1993 Family Support Act. The New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities established the regional family support planning councils, and we're comprised of 10 councils throughout the state. And we're a venue to provide parents and family members of people with developmental disabilities knowledge, information, and support. So that is our function, and I'm happy to be here and moderate this event today. So I'm pleased to announce that we have Dave Ellis, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Resilience within the Department of Children and Families. We also have Paul Aronsohn, who's our Ombudsman for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we have Dr. Jill Hinton, who is a clinical psychologist. Okay, so I guess we will start with Dave. And just a little background on Dave. He is currently serving as the Executive Director for the Office of Resilience within the Department of Children and Families. And Dave is a national leader in providing trainings and facilitating conversations regarding toxic stress in the lives of young children and the lasting impact that that's going to have within generational trauma. He also worked with both families and organizations to prevent ACEs and advance research and survey efforts. His prior experience in several Minnesota government initiatives includes facilitating community dialogues and public-private partnerships to promote well-being across Minneapolis. And we thank Dave, who is actually in Arizona right now, for joining us at this early hour. So our next speaker is Dr. Jill Hinton, who's a clinical psychologist who has over 30 years of experience working with people with intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and mental illness. As a clinical director of the Center of START Services Institute on Disability and the University of at the University of New Hampshire, Dr. Hinton provides consultation and training to START teams across the country. She's been a strong leader in raising awareness of mental health in IDD and promotes best practices. And then we have Paul Aronsohn, who's the first ombudsman for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the state of New Jersey. He is a lead advocate and ally for New Jersey residents in need of critical services and supports ranging from early childhood through adulthood. And previously, Paul held several positions in both public and private sectors. And Paul's understanding and passion for disability issues is rooted in personal family experience. And we thank all of our speakers this morning. So our theme is the pathway to resilience, and I guess I will open it up to Dave.
Thank you, Eileen. It truly is a pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you for the invitation. And a special thank you to Kyoko, who has taken on the task of advancing my slides for me. Just quickly, first of all, I recognized when I looked at myself in that photo that I have to take a new one. I don't know that I have worn a suit in probably 15 years or so. So I think I'll take a different one. And just to give you a little bit different type of a background, I am a father of 5 adult children. I have 19 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. I am a retired state employee after spending about 25 years of working for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. My wife and I are both former resource family. parents. We had foster kids before we got married, and we had kinship children. Some of our grandchildren we were raising in our homes until we moved to Somerset, New Jersey in July of 2020. So I say all of that to let you know that I'm more grounded in family and community than I am anything else. And I came to the state of New Jersey in this position as the executive director of the Office of Resilience on two conditions. I had been coming here for about 5 years working with the New Jersey Education Association, helping them move from where they were to becoming more trauma-informed and healing-centered. My first condition of coming here was that I had to be invited. You don't walk into someone else's backyard and start to dig it up without asking permission. And knowing what I was going to be doing coming to New Jersey, it was definitely going to be digging up things and talking about things that most folks don't want to have to talk about. The other thing was that whatever it was that we were going to do, because I wasn't coming with a plan, whatever it was that we were going to create had to be done in partnership with the community. And so know that whatever it is that I'm talking about today is focused from community itself. And for me, when I talk about community, I'm talking about those who are most directly impacted. The system has been one that has been closed and has been led by professionals. And my belief is that the solutions are in community, and that those who are most directly impacted should be the ones who are in lead positions and making decisions. Kyoko, if we could go to the next slide, please. There we go. So the Office of Resilience is kind of a unique place. We are one of a kind office. There is nothing else like it. It is a partnership between 3 foundations and state government. The position that I occupy is the only one of its kind in the country. So New Jersey is kind of in a unique place, and I am constantly getting phone calls and emails asking how this happened, because I am in the Department of Children and Families, but I am not a state employee. I am a contractor, and yet I am part of the Commissioner Byers' executive team. In addition to that, the responsibility that we have around creating and implementing a plan to address adverse childhood experiences is a statewide initiative. It's not focused through DCF, even though there are folks who believe that it is. We touch every state agency that is there. And our role is to help each state agency figure out how they're going to implement the statewide plan that was created. We released that plan in February. So we've only been at this work now for what? 2 and 9, so about 7 months now. We've been at this work. And as I go through and talk a little bit more about where we were and where we are and what we intend to do, I think you'll see that there's been a lot of change in 7 months, and recognizing that there is still a lot more change. Next slide, please. So the plan that we created and this office are unique in a number of ways. We want to form a partnership. We recognize that the Office of Resilience by itself is really nothing, that there has to be the partnership, the collaboration with the community itself in order to make this work. We want to be a bridge. We want to be able to provide you with information about laws and policies, what events are coming up, and then to create the plan for how we move forward in partnership with the community. We have a number of different places, and thank you, Kyoko. I see she is following up with the things that I hope will happen. She has put the link to the statewide action plan into the chat so that you'll be able to find that. And you'll hear me referring to a thing called the virtual learning community. So if any of you are familiar with a thing called PACES Connection, formerly ACES Connection, Adverse Childhood Experiences Now it's positive and adverse childhood experiences. It is an online site. We have a New Jersey specific site, and somewhere in here will be my email. And on my email, the link to that specific site is there. It's a way of staying in contact, asking questions, finding resources across the state of New Jersey. It's a place where people can blog. We offer multiple opportunities for people to engage. You see under education, we talk about training. We offer specific training around adverse childhood experiences that was created by one of the co-principal investigators. I spent yesterday for about 2 hours meeting with Dr. Rob Anda, who is one of the co-principal investigators, and Dr. Bruce Perry, who is one of the leaders in the field. If I don't know if you're familiar, he and Oprah released a book entitled What Happened to You. And if you ever get a chance to listen to the audiobook, I would recommend it. People that I talk to often tell me that when they listen to this, they have their aha moment about what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about the adversities in the lives of children and the impact across the life course. We want to be able to offer resources. In doing so, we offer everything from the trainings on ACEs that I just referred to. And if you're interested as an organization, and if you're just interested as a parent group, and you would like to have a presentation on ACEs, simply email me and I will put you in contact with folks. We have about 150 presenters across the state that are trained to do this presentation. And we like this one because it's specific to ACEs. Most of the presentations that we've evaluated, they are based around relationships. They talk about ACEs, but they don't dive into it. So, and one of the things that we want to do is when people start talking about ACEs, you'll hear me use that term a lot because I want people to begin to understand. I want us to be able to talk in a common language so that when we say ACEs, everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. As I said, we want to be the bridge. We want to be a knowledge hub. We do things like evaluating assessments for agencies to become trauma informed. And so when you go to that virtual learning community, you'll find a link to a review that we've done of virtually every trauma informed care assessment that is utilized in the country. And you'll find recommendations on which ones you might want to consider and a request that if you decide you want to use something else, please let us work with you so that we can use that evaluation. But from you, what we're looking for is just a commitment. And all of you have already made that commitment to be in this work and to stay in this work. We want to talk about how long does it take to get a response. Oftentimes, one of the biggest complaints I'm hearing right now from the field is the time it takes to get an intake response from agencies. And so we're going to undertake that and try to figure out what do we do to make sure that instead of waiting a month to get services, that people get responses the same day. There is a way to do it. We just have to work with community to figure out what that is. So if you want to move to the next slide, I know I have a limited amount of time. And I want to make sure that I get to all of these things. So the plan itself is focused in 5 areas. 1, around becoming a trauma-informed and healing-centered state. We want to create a public awareness about ACEs. And we have right now a public awareness campaign that's statewide that is focused right now on educators and law enforcement. That will shift soon to community itself. We also want to have a driven policy and funding priorities that are directed by the community. And to give you an idea of what we're talking about there, we believe that there are agencies that are doing some really good work in the state of New Jersey, but they are not funded by the state because they can't meet the state's criteria. Or they're so small that they don't want to, but they have brilliant ideas. So soon you're going to see the release of an RFP, or actually an RFI, a request for ideas, that will give us a process that allows us to fund small agencies that have never been funded, and ideas. So we're going to take ideas and see if we can't figure out how to put those together with organizations and agencies that want to do this work, or even individuals. And we're going to resource them. I'll have about $3 million at my disposal that we're going to put out in that process over the next 2 years, and we'll see where it leads us. But I think it will give us a deeper look at what else is available to us in the community that we believe is actually working out there. We want to look at cross-sector training, which I've already talked about, and we want to promote trauma-informed and healing-centered as the way that we want to move. We want to create what we refer to as healing-centered communities across the state of New Jersey, and you'll begin to see those popping up. We've got about 7 different locations that are already online, and we'll be expanding as we go. The next slide, please. This is what the work looked like in New Jersey at the beginning. And I like crude drawings, rudimentary drawings, because they actually do tell the picture. This is the work across New Jersey. There was a lot of stuff going on here, but it wasn't connected. And that was one of the first things we recognized when we came here. Everyone was in their silo and people just weren't talking to one another. So people in the north didn't know what was happening central or south, and the same thing with everyone else. Next slide, please. When we released the plan in February, this is what happened. There was almost an explosion immediately of people coming together to have conversations, to talk about what they were doing. And yes, it's a mess. I was told early on in my career that every presentation needs to have an octopus slide. You know, the one that has so many things on it that you can't figure out where anything is going. This is my octopus slide. This is also, if you think about how brains develop, the first slide is, if you were to think about it, is what we have at birth. We don't have very many connections. We just have the ones that are really centralized and siloed. And then all of a sudden we hit the world and we get hooked up to a fire hose. And we get all of this information going into us. That space between 0 and 3 years of age, where 85% of brain development happens, that's what this is. This is that immediate onset after we released that statewide plan. And you'll see the Office of Resilience kind of upper right, and you'll see a thing called ACE Interface. That's the organization that has the curriculum that's licensed, that we have brought to the state of New Jersey, and that we are moving deeper and deeper in the community. And you'll notice that we're tied to everything. We want to be tied even more. You see the letter P for presenter, T for trainer. There are all kinds of things in that little mess. We refer to that as arborization. So all those things that were happening, now they're like on steroids. They've grown like a grape arbor. Next slide, please. And I'm not tracking time, so Eileen, if you would please wave at me when we get down close to time, so I don't overshoot this.
Okay, certainly, but we love what we're hearing, so just the way.
Okay, thank you. So this is what we anticipate will be the future. That big dot in the middle will be the Office of Resilience, and that's where we are trying to take up that role now. And you'll notice that some of those lines got really strong. They got really dark. Those are lines that lead to people, organizations that have license, excuse me, that are licensed in the state of New Jersey to do the training that we were talking about. Because we see training around adverse childhood experiences as being foundational. So much so that one of the things that we're pushing for right now in the Office of Higher Education is that we want to do a 5 college and university pilot to put ACEs into it. We want it to become a requirement to graduate. Right now, we graduate social workers, doctors, all kinds of folks who are in the helping professions that have a lot of education and don't have an understanding of the life experience of a person who has been through trauma. And so we believe that that's foundational if we're truly going to impact what's going on. I find that when we do trainings, we often focus, people want to know what the answer is. They want us to give them that silver bullet. The first thing we tell people is there is no silver bullet. There's only silver buckshot. There's a lot of things that we know that work, that we can utilize, but there is no silver bullet, no one thing that's going to help us deal with what we're dealing with. But becoming educated around ACEs is one of the first things that needs to happen. Next slide. So this is the full the full picture, if you will. If you were to see the actual presentation that we do, you would see a slide that looks a lot like this, that talks about the neurodevelopment of children. The first slide would be at birth. The middle slide would be somewhere around the 6-7 year range. And that third one would be around the age of puberty. And so that's the progression that we see, where we have those few connections at the beginning, the explosion in the middle, where the arborization happens, and then the pruning that happens on in that further stages. And with the pruning, it's that what we keep in mind, that it's those things that get experienced the most that get hardwired in. And it's the way that we want the process of learning. We want to have people talking so much about trauma and adversity that it becomes hardwired in, that it is something that we pay attention to all the time. We pass legislation all the time, and we ask for fiscal impact statements before we pass them. Has anybody ever done a trauma impact statement? Has anybody ever thought about what are the unintended traumatic consequences of the laws that we pass? We do a lot of things in that space of wanting to do good that have unintended consequences, that if we just take a little bit of time and think it through, we might recognize some of those, and we might not traumatize people as much as we do. And I hate to say this, but our institutions do traumatize. I work in an agency, the Department of Children and Families. Our whole agency is about trauma. Even the people in our fiscal area, the work that they do is around paying bills for trauma. My contention is that we have to move to that space where we think about preventing some of this, not just intervening. Because quite frankly, we teach a lot of the trauma. We show our children what that is by the way we do things. And our children do pay attention as much as we think that they don't, they do. Next slide, please. You see my rudimentary drawings continue. We created a thing called what was originally called a trauma-informed healing-centered technical assistance center, a TICTAC. And we started thinking about how do we talk about the work that we do in a way that people can understand. And this came up. And if you look at the base, and everything always starts at the bottom for us, we always look at the soil. New Jersey is the soil. It's the communities here in New Jersey where everything begins. It's where it begins. It's also where it ends. The vision that we have is to engage New Jersey communities to imagine and co-create healing, supportive, and trusting futures, right? We want to be able to just open that space for people to move from, I don't know, I always people used to talk about meeting people where they are. I'm not so sure that's what I want to do anymore. I think I want to meet people where they dream, because oftentimes where they are is not where they want to be. And so I want to be, it's interesting. I was mentioning to someone the other day, New Jersey's an interesting place because every TV show, every movie I watch has a reference to something connected to New Jersey. And I don't know how that happens, but I want you to start, when you're watching TV and you're listening to things, I want you to stop and listen for connections to New Jersey. But one of the things that, as I take my walks in the morning, I listen to music. And Bruce Springsteen native Jersey son, has a song called Make Me the Land of Open Dreams. And that's what I want to be. That's what I want the Office of Resilience to be. I want people to be able to dream, and I want to be able to remove the barriers so that they can. Each one of those petals on that flower has something specific in it. And one of them talks about neuroscience education. They're all tied basically to those 5 pieces from the action plan. But what you'll notice in the middle, there's only one flower on this screen right now. Our belief is that in the center, where all of the seeds are for the future, that those seeds will fall to the ground. That's you. And that eventually we're going to have a field of flowers. That it won't just be one. That as those petals begin to fall off and fall back to the ground, that they'll nourish the community. And that the community will grow and thrive. And that there'll be more flowers. The things you see at the top, yep, you do need to begin where the person is, but I really want to talk to them about what they dream about. Because if I get them to tell me that, we can work on where they're at. We can begin to understand that. I just believe that there's something in that dreaming phase. But you'll look up at the top, you'll notice that it says OOR pollinators. That's Office of Resilience pollinators. That's my staff, that's me, that's you, that's everybody in this work. We're like the butterflies and bees. We move things around. We want to be able to move the ideas. The theory that we have in building self-healing communities is that we don't own anything. We want to learn about things and give it away to the community to utilize. Free. Next slide, please.
So Dave, we are, oh, okay. It's the Q&A slide.
I was hoping that was it.
The Q&A. So we are, okay, let's see if we have a few, I think you already addressed Walter's comment, right? So we have some comments here. So I think you already addressed this one, but you need to still begin where the person is as
Yep.
you help move them. Okay, so you addressed that one.
Absolutely.
And that's part of creating pathway from where you are now to where you want to be, from which is so positive. And in our work, I think, positivity is so key. I mean, for children as well into as adults. And we have a lot of people in our group that we represent the whole spectrum. So I think your office is really going to be positive for everyone.
Can I just make one comment, Eileen?
Sure. Yeah.
The plan that we created is a living plan.
Mm-hmm.
We anticipate going back every year and engaging with the community to find out what did we miss, because we know we missed stuff. In fact, I've been called by SPAN and a number of organizations to say, we don't see disabilities specifically called out. And we recognize that, right? As we went through, one of the first things we said is, okay, we're going to get criticized because we didn't hit everything. And that's okay. That's what people should be doing. But let me tell you that this plan, the one thing that we are trying to get folks to understand, I learned a lesson from my wife. As I walk up and down the street, I find curb cuts everywhere. When curb cuts were originally designed, they were not designed for able-bodied people. They were designed to help people with mobility issues be able to access and walk and get up and down sidewalks in a much easier fashion. But I will tell you that as an able-bodied, well, mostly able-bodied, let me put it that way. I'll be 70 at the end of this year, so I'm beginning to slow myself down a little bit. And even having said that, I use curb cuts all the time. I find that my life is much easier. But the lesson that you learn from that is, if we just design for disability, everybody wins. That what we are doing for the disability community benefits everyone. So why can't we see that in everything that we do And as we're designing this design with disability in mind, I think we'll be in a much better place. Thank you again for the invitation.
Oh, and so Dave, you're able to stay with us, right?
Oh yeah, I'll be
The
here.
panel, and we absolutely appreciate your wisdom, and I'm really excited about this office and what what you can potentially achieve.
Thank you. And thank you to that nice person who said that I look wonderful. There are days I'm not sure of that.
You're
I
looking
do have
good.
to leave right at noon though. I have
Okay.
another 3-hour presentation with the National
Wow.
Committee and Parents Group today. So,
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you. Okay, so I am pleased to announce, my goodness, where am I? Dr. Jill Hinton from the Clinical Director of START Services, the Institute on Disability at the University of New Hampshire. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you. Am I able to share my screen? Could you?
Yes.
Okay. Great. All right. I'm really happy to be with you this morning. As Eileen said, I'm the clinical director for the Center for START Services. We are based out of the Institute on Disability. I actually live in North Carolina though, but work for the University of New Hampshire. And we work with multiple states across the United States in implementing the START model, which is a crisis prevention and intervention program for people who have intellectual developmental disabilities and co-occurring behavioral health needs. So that's the background I come from. So obviously in the work that we do as a crisis team that works within communities, the issue of trauma and being trauma informed is critical to our work. So it's the work we do. I also personally, with other work I do in North Carolina, do a lot of training within North Carolina and some other states on trauma informed care and trauma in people with IDD. So really glad to be with you. I'm really impressed with what Dave shared around the Office of Resilience. You're really unique, as he said, in that, and it's nice to see a state trying to address from a trauma-informed approach. So I'm going to start with SAMHSA's definitions. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, just to kind of get us started. They define the 3 E's of trauma and the 4 R's of a trauma-informed approach. So the 3 E's in terms of trauma is that trauma results from some event or circumstances or series of events that is experienced by a person as physically or emotionally harmful and then has lasting effects. For people with IDD, I highlighted experienced by, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the PowerPoint. But keep that in mind, is that trauma is really individualized and personal, and what's traumatic or difficult for me may not be as difficult for you, and that for people with IDD, we may miss some of the potentially traumatizing events that happen to them because we see it through our lens instead of through their lens. So I really want us to remember that experienced part as we go through today. And then again, we're participating in these 4 R's today, and we'll talk a little bit about the prevalence and how this affects people with IDD. And you all are learning more about that. And obviously New Jersey is responding to some of this knowledge already by trying to put that in practice. And as we do that, we set up policies and services that resist re-traumatizing people. So again, you're on the right path. And I'm, again, really excited about that Office of Resilience that you have in New Jersey. So obviously, some of the things I'm going to talk about right now and in the next couple of slides are hard for us to think about sometimes in terms of the prevalence of trauma in the population of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But I think it's important that we recognize the problem, right? And the difficulties in order for us to put strategies in place that help us. We know overall the work we do with the Center for START Services, recognizing and research recognizing that people with IDD are more likely to experience mental health symptoms than the neurotypical population, with about 40% having some co-occurring psychiatric disorder. This ranges from anxiety, maybe mild depression, all the way up to some more significant psychiatric diagnoses like bipolar disorder. And we also know in this population, but also in general population, that that mental health symptoms are multifactorial. They have a lot of causes for them, but that experiencing adverse and stressful life events certainly plays a role. So we just talked about the ACEs study, and as a population in general, we know that adverse experiences affect all of us in some way, in terms of increasing our risks for different medical psychiatric issues. So with people with IDD, exposure to traumatizing life events is higher. And we think often about some of the big T's, the big, physical assault, being in a horrible accident, being the victim of some type of crime. Those are kind of those big T's we talk about, and people with IDD are more at risk for some of those things. In addition, they're also more at risk for other things that sometimes we don't, like I said, we don't pay attention to, being separated from family or friends, or being moved frequently, loss of relationships. So there are those big things we think about, and then there's just life experiences, and the ACEs pointed some of those out too, that affect us over time. So trauma and IDD, and again, remember when I talked about that experience, right? When we say estimates as high as 90%, that's from the lens of somebody with IDD and experiencing services and going through school and going through life, being exposed to events that are perceived by them as negative and as traumatizing is very likely. We do know they're more likely to experience sexual abuse, for example. So again, thinking about the experience part, and thinking about negative life events, some of the things that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, people with IDD have a higher risk of developing medical issues. So maybe more hospital procedures, medical procedures that perhaps somebody hasn't taken the time to help them be informed about that, and what that means for them. So those kind of things can be traumatizing. Frequent change in caregivers. They're direct support professionals who work with somebody for maybe a couple years and then go on to school or leave to do something else. And those kind of life losses are difficult for folks. We know that there's still the work that we're doing in the disability field to reduce stigma and to promote inclusion, that despite all that work we're doing, there's still some of that is around. So in school systems and with bullying and being excluded from some social activities, all of these can be experienced as negative life events and as traumatizing for people with IDD. I mentioned life loss as one of the other areas that I'm really interested in people with IDD is grief, and how as a system we often don't address grief in people with IDD. So again, as caregivers change, friends move away, death of family members, even in school, like, having a favorite teacher that may work with you for a couple of years and losing that, being moved. We know adults with IDD often change places of residence very frequently. And all of these things that are common to all of us can be more complicated in somebody with IDD. Again, people with IDD often have smaller natural circles of support around them. So losses in that circle of support can be significant. And the service system providers often don't pay attention or not sure how to handle things that people are experiencing grief over. So sometimes there's an uncertainty about how do you walk through that with somebody. And so we often ignore it for people with IDD. And when you ignore grief, it can become traumatizing for folks. So in general, as we think about the ACEs study and then think about people with IDD, I think the ACEs can be a starting point for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities of seeing what things they may have been exposed to, but also to recognize that there's a broader range of life events that appear to be experienced as traumatic by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that may not all show up on the ACEs study. So again, paying attention to the things that we might miss. So I'm going to divert just a second to help make a point, which is that we know people with IDD are more likely to be exposed to trauma. And we also know that people with IDD are more likely to develop long-lasting effects or develop PTSD after exposure to these trauma. And let's think a little bit about why that happens. So for people with intellectual and developmental disability, we often talk about this concept of executive functioning. Executive functioning is the mental processes that we all use that help us connect our past experiences with our present action. It's kind of some people describe it as the conductor of the orchestra in our brain, of connecting things together, making meaning, helping us make decisions, helping us plan, organize, pay attention to the right things, manage our time, really allow us to adapt to unexpected circumstances that might come up, and perform everyday life. So we know by virtue of having an intellectual or developmental disability that executive functioning is affected in some way with people with IDD. So when we think about that happens primarily in our prefrontal cortex, the front of our brain here. So people with IDD often have some differences in how their brain works by virtue of having an intellectual and developmental disability. Sometimes that is affecting the prefrontal cortex. That region of the brain is also very, very sensitive to stress for all of us, including people with IDD. And so mild stress can kind of flood that part of the cortex with dopamine, which kind of shuts down our executive functioning. So if we all think about that, we all experience times when our executive functioning is not at top performance. So think about a unexpected, like you're driving down the road and you have a flat tire. So you may immediately get off the road, but for a few minutes, it takes you a few minutes to get your thoughts together, right? So if for that dopamine rush in your front part of your brain makes you have to take a few breaths, reorient, be able to get back online, kind of to think about what do I do next. And you have those moments when you just can't think. We all say that, I just couldn't think straight, right? I couldn't get my thoughts together. So we know that stress affects that, and certainly trauma also affects that. So some of the things that executive functioning allows us to do are to, start and stop an activity when we need to, change and shift, transition, make alterations to what we're planning to do because of unexpected events. Use our working memory. So think about what we've experienced in the past and use that to inform decisions we're going to make moving forward. And then several other things, but monitor, self-regulate, inhibit. The ones I have highlighted are the ones from my experience that people with IDD who have experienced trauma really have difficulty with, which is adjusting, changing, shifting to new and unexpected things happening, being able to access what they've learned in the past to affect their current presentation, decisions, those kind of things, and being able to self-regulate, to regulate their emotions, to regulate their outward behaviors, the ability to inhibit responses. Those things seem to be areas that are difficult for folks. Before trauma, it may be a little difficult for folks with IDD sometimes to do these, but then especially after trauma or as a result of traumatic experiences, these areas are sometimes difficult for folks. I'm not going to go through all these, but these are some of the things that executive functioning deficits look like in terms of the ability to kind of respond to things that are happening around us. So I mentioned the prefrontal cortex earlier, just really, really quickly to talk about the effect of trauma. And I'm sure that your Office of Resilience is doing a lot of training around these same type of concepts, but I just mentioned executive functioning. And so it happens in that cerebral cortex, prefrontal cortex, we're able to think about the future, make plans, make decisions, those kind of things. And that's the most advanced part of our brain. The limbic system is where we have all our emotions, store emotional information. The cerebellum controls our motor and motor memory. And then the brainstem is kind of those core regulatory functions, our body temperature, heart rate, kind of survival related functions. So when we talk about trauma is affecting that lower part of the brain, really making us pay attention, be hypervigilant, which is necessary, right? So when we're in a difficult, again, I mentioned, we get into sometimes a situation where we have to act quickly, we want our body to respond. For example, if you touch a hot stove, you don't want your prefrontal cortex to have to reason out whether or not you pull your hand away. So when you touch a hot stove, the lower part of your brain is acting, right? That brainstem and that cerebellum are causing you to pull your hand away before you have time to think about it. And we need that function in our brain for us to survive. But for most of the day, and for most of us, we go through the day and are able to access that higher part of our brain where we can think and feel and plan and go about our day. Sometimes we're interrupted with something that makes us respond from the lower part of the brain. People who have experienced traumatic events, that lower part of their brain becomes very sensitized, so that they may perceive things that really aren't threats, but they perceive them as threats. So then they react from the lower part of their brain. So, in working with folks with IDD who have co-occurring behavioral health needs, I often get referrals on folks and the system is saying their behavior is coming out of nowhere, right? Because they can't see why somebody responded to something the way they did. And from a trauma-informed approach, we will be thinking, what has happened in the past that is creating this trigger that's making somebody respond really quickly and maybe over-respond to stimuli in their environment. So it's all coming from the brain. And again, if we think about for people with IDD, having some difference in the way that their brain works from the neurotypical population to start with, which may make it more difficult for them to access the higher parts of their brain at certain times, then trauma added to that really has a more significant impact on people with intellectual and developmental disability. Trauma does, with the work that your state is doing, I'm sure you've had trainings around trauma being a developmental insult in terms of it impacting further development. And it affects that self-regulatory process that we talked about before. And we know that people's brains respond differently after trauma. So less executive functioning and more kind of reaction, fight or flight. And these are the things within an intellectual developmental disability system, in the states that I've worked with that the systems are often struggling with, is how do we respond to people whose presentations are challenging for us, who are responding probably from that fight or flight perspective, and that's creating difficulties for the people around them. So that's what states are working with to try to through START, what we try to address and understand. I'm not going to go through all of this either. The more dark part at the top of these boxes, there are some of the parts of PTSD diagnoses. And the point of this is to realize that people with IDD often the trauma is missed and we end up with diagnoses that don't make sense. And part of that is because people don't realize that PTSD or trauma response can look different in somebody with IDD. And so often what we see, again, is an externalized presentation. Somebody may be re-experiencing a traumatic event, but they're acting it out in a way that is troubling to other people, and it gets misinterpreted. Or my least favorite word in the world that I see is non-compliant. When that's described as that may be somebody trying to refuse to participate in an activity because it's too scary for them and it's triggering for them. Is their only way to get out of something that's really scary, things that we can decide if we've had a scary experience. Let's just say something simple, like we've seen a snake when we were out walking at some point. We can decide I'm not going to walk on that path again because I've seen a couple of snakes on that path. I'm going to avoid that. And sometimes in our service system, we don't allow people enough choices to avoid the things that are re-traumatizing to them. So their only way to tell us that sometimes is to refuse, and then people get upset that they refuse, or to have externalized behaviors that get misinterpreted. So it's really, really important that we see people with IDD from this trauma-informed lens. And as I said before, when we don't recognize that traumatic and negative life experiences have created this kind of trauma-based brain for people, and that they're just attempting to manage their fear, and people just pay attention to the externalized behavior, what we end up with are these long list of diagnoses for people that are based on that external presentation, and we're not paying attention to the underlying reasons. Dave mentioned What Happened to You, the book with Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. Bruce Perry is one of my favorite writers around trauma, and he talks about this as the state becoming a trait. So we see this external presentation, and then we make assumptions and have all these diagnoses for people that don't really make sense and don't help us, don't lead us to better treatment for folks. And when you have those type of experiences, again, for people with IDD, having difficult with kind of managing strong emotions, sometimes trauma presents as irritability and anxiety. So we really have to think about taking that broader context into consideration when we're working with folks with IDD who may have experienced trauma. So that's all the hard stuff, and some of the kind of realizing the prevalence and understanding that it impacts folks with IDD. The good news, and like your Office of Resilience is demonstrating, the good news is we can create environments that promote resiliency for all people who have experienced trauma, including people with IDD. And when we begin to see these external presentations as searching for safety, we can use that to promote healing. So there are things we can do, and I think that's what we want to make sure we discuss today. I'll start with what does not help. As a psychologist who's worked in lots of systems, what does not help us is when we assume that behavior is intentional. Maybe my second least favorite word is manipulate. When we see people from that perspective, that does not help us to problem solve and to help that person with positive strategies. It doesn't help us to think that that person has control over their behavior when they're in a very stressful or traumatic situation, a stressful situation that may be reminding them of something bad that happened to them in the past. We know that from trauma, that when anybody is re-experiencing a traumatic past experience, that they don't have control over their behavior at that time. They're operating, remember the brain? They're operating from that move your hand away from the heat perspective. So we can't make that assumption. We can't take that personally, that people react based on their past experience. And if we simply focus on some kind of oversimplified contingency program, again, I'm a psychologist. I've done my share of bad behavior plans in the past. I feel like I'm reformed from that now. But if you think about contingencies like giving people reinforcements or setting up a behavior plan for somebody who's experienced trauma, it makes no sense, because we just said a person in that situation, their behavior is not intentional and it's a reaction, and they don't really have control over it in that moment. So when we add restrictions or try to control people, we're actually re-traumatizing, because part of trauma is feeling powerlessness, feeling no agency over your own body. And when we try to restrict and control, we just add to that trauma. And then this last thing is that for people with IDD, we have to be careful around how we do trauma treatment. So for somebody who's not really had any trauma therapy, expecting that if they just tell us about their trauma, then that's going to help things get better that's not that simple, right? And for folks with IDD, there's a lot of other work that needs to be done to help them be resilient, not just tell their story, but develop other skills and strategies that they can use. So the things that do help, I want to kind of end on this positive part, is I really approach things from a positive psychology perspective and positive support perspective. We have to recognize people's strengths in order to build resilience. So we focus on increasing happiness and joy in people's lives, right? Because those kind of connections, we talked about every brain connection, all those brain connections that Dave talked about earlier. Every experience we have builds another connection, and we want to build as many of those positive connections as we can. So engagement, attachments, very important, enhancing relationships, building natural supports for folks. We do need to build in some skills for people. So working with folks on their ability to label feelings, to understand their feelings, to create calming strategies, and really develop a functional way to communicate their distress is also very important. And then building this strong positive identity, focusing on people's strengths, nurturing who they are, not what they do, to really nurture that sense of identity and not see people from the perspective of these externalizing behaviors, which are often symptoms of underlying trauma. So that's my really quick spiel. I do trauma training, which this stuff could take a day to go through and really talk about, but I hope that this kind of gives you a sense of understanding the prevalence, the impact, and then that there are things we can do to help and make things better for people.
Oh, thank you, Jill. So really, I love your focus on the positive aspect of things and just nurturing that for individuals. And we do charting the life course as well. And I think that needs to be a total focus for the whole holistic approach.
Yep.
Also, there's other issues in terms of identifying the ACEs problem and getting the appropriate help for individuals when they're young. And then if they don't get it, then it just carries over throughout the lifespan. So I think, and I also, from my perspective, my son is now 30, and I'm noticing a really big change in him, and he can't verbally communicate. So it's would be really interesting just to have him in some kind of focus group or something, just to see. So, but really appreciative of your work for sure. Are you able to stay for the panel?
I could stay around for a little while.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, thank you. I'm just seeing if there's anything in the chat here. People are wondering if your slides are going to be available.
I can send them to you, Eileen.
Okay, that would be really great. And all righty. Let me see here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at this point, but I would have to say, I just think it's wonderful that there's a focus and that you're inclusive of people with disabilities, because I think we're left out often. And it's just as impactful, as you said, if not more so, with our people that are struggling, for sure. So okay, so I guess I'm going to now introduce Paul Aronsohn, our Ombudsman for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Great. Thanks, Eileen, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really glad and grateful that we're having this conversation. It's so important because, as conversation has already suggested, disability can and often is traumatic. It's traumatic for the individual with the disability. It's traumatic for the family and everybody in that individual's life. And it's something that we talk about often in our office. As most of you know, there's two of us in our office, myself and Christine Bachter. Both of us are family members. We come from families with disability, and we both work with other individuals and families on a daily basis. And the trauma is real. The trauma is real, and it's ongoing. And it's something that doesn't, to your point, Eileen, doesn't get addressed often enough. I was actually reading, I'm in the process of reading Judy Heumann's autobiography. And I was struck early on in the book, she talks about her childhood experience as well as her experience in college. And she talks about the exclusion that she felt as somebody with disability and how that in itself was so traumatic. And so, Jill talked about how, how trauma is related to disability in different ways, but just the act of having a disability and having to constantly, interact with government, trying to get services and being rejected and having to sort of beg and plead and, and to get access to medical care. It's an ongoing traumatic experience. And it's something that, again, as a family member growing up with disability in my family, I became, very aware of, but particularly in this job over the last 3.5 years, working with individuals and families. I mean, often, people come to us when there's a problem. And so we're dealing with folks that are experiencing trauma, that have not only experienced it in the past, but are experiencing it in the present. And one of the things we note in our last annual report, in our 2020 annual report, is that everybody working in this space in government, everybody working with folks with disabilities should be trained in trauma-informed care. We need to know, we need to understand the trauma associated with disability. And as Christine pointed out when we were writing our report, we've got to take great care, not just in understanding and recognizing and understanding it, but not making it worse. Not, as Jill said, re-traumatizing people, which so often happens. When a family needs a service and they're in desperate need of something and their phone calls don't get returned, or they don't get, a response from the government, or they get the wrong response. We have this tendency to re-traumatize folks. And I think, I can't emphasize this enough. Folks with disabilities, again, and I see a lot of the names of familiar families and members on this meeting today. We talk about this all the time. And, one of the things, as I've sort of become more and more aware of this, started to try to read up on the literature on ACEs, on trauma-informed care. And one of the things that has been striking to me has been the absence of a discussion on disability. I mean, it exists in some respects, but often it's sort of characterized as more as the outcome of ACEs, as that disability can be one of the outcomes of, adverse childhood experiences, as opposed to the cause, of ACEs and of trauma in general. So again, I just, I don't want to belabor the point. I'd love to open this up for discussion, but I hope today's meeting is really the start of an ongoing conversation throughout our government and throughout our community on trauma associated with disability. Again, not just for the individual who has a disability, which is extremely important and ongoing, but also for the family members. One of the things Christine and I deal with a lot is, siblings, childhood, children, brothers and sisters that are experiencing PTSD and other psychological sort of offshoots, if you will, of their siblings' disability. It's just, it's something so prevalent, so real, and so important and profound. Again, I keep saying this, but I'm just glad we're having this conversation. I hope this is really the start of some ongoing work in this field. So that's it. I'd love to just open up.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. Yeah, I was just saying, as I'm listening as well, just thinking about just the stigma, and the stigma is not just for the individual with the disability, it's also for the family and how we impact his reality, kind of a thing. So and when we were putting together this forum, I was saying, wow, I wish we had this information when my kid was young. I wish we had the Office of Resiliency back then, and I wish there was more of a focus and less stigma associated with trauma and mental illness as it relates to a disability. So all good things for our young people coming up for sure now, and then just to try to relate that to what we can experience, or what we can help our loved ones experience now as they go through things. So I don't know if that's really a question for anybody. I think we could open up the panel at this point, but I would just say, one of the questions was where do folks begin, I guess, if there is an issue for a family that has a child that's experiencing trauma that is having an adverse reaction. So I guess I would open it up there. I guess that would be a beginning point, maybe if we could have some guidance in that regard for anyone.
I mean, I don't know about the logistics of the resources in New Jersey, but I think the very first part of that is like you just said, somebody recognizing that this what's happening now may be related to trauma. So I think the recognition is the first step.
Mhm.
And then at the very least, like I said, you know, we're starting with let's avoid re-traumatizing somebody. So our reaction to that presentation is going to be critical. So if people in the support system are seeing it as behavioral, in quotations, then that's going to lead us down the wrong path. So I think trying to think about that initial response as a response of understanding, and then, as I said, trying to make sure we're approaching this from understanding where this came from and responding from that perspective as opposed to control, restriction, restraint, those kind of things that can happen in response, which re-traumatizes and kind of sets us down the wrong path. So I think the first step is what you just said, which is a family member saying, this is something new that I've never seen before with my family member. I wonder where this could be coming from, and not jumping to, oh, we've got a new behavior problem, but rather, what is this communicating to us and how do we begin to investigate this together?
Right, and I think that there's just a natural kind of assumption that if you're a person with a disability, that's what's driving everything, and you know, it must be the disability and nothing that we can really fix. We can just try to modify or work on behavioral plans or something of this nature to address it, instead of saying, wait, it could be that plus something else, you know. So I think that there needs to be people that are more open to looking at the holistic person as they are addressing these issues. I think, right?
Eileen,
Yes.
if I might, I just think that there's also this piece that we have to recognize that what we see are adaptations, right? There's nothing wrong with anyone.
Right.
It's about what happened. And so if we can move from looking at what we believe is wrong because a behavior doesn't necessarily fit what society believes it should be, from that space that says that there's something wrong, to that space of what happened, we can shift the dynamic of how we have this conversation. And that becomes exceptionally important because it takes the shame and blame out of a lot of this. And when I talk with people about trauma, that's a big part of the underpinning, is that there's a shame and blame attached to it all, and especially for parents. You know, the system is not nice when it comes to things like this. And, you know, as I said, I'm a former foster parent, and I have disabilities throughout my family. The system isn't gentle. And Paul, your comments are absolutely spot on. You know, we have to figure out how, and if the system does what it's supposed to do, it should be helping families, not hurting. And by all means, not making it worse from where it is. It's already bad enough. And the last thing I'll tell you, and I will be quiet for a little while, is I don't believe that any of us are broken. And so I don't see a need to try to fix anything. I believe that everything that we have is an adaptation, that there is no such thing as a maladaptation. Everything is an adaptation to whatever happens to us. And so if I can approach this in a different way that says, I can value everybody, regardless of where we are in this space, we're all here together. And the question is, how do we actually live in this space and be kind and compassionate and gentle with each other?
If I could add on to what Dave just said about families, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the most disturbing things that I've learned in this position has been how unkind the system is to families, and how, in fact, abusive it is to families, whether it's laying guilt for their child's disability, or making them feel like they should be grateful for the little that they get. The dynamic that sometimes happens between government officials or providers and family members, it's horrible, and we need to be more sensitive to it. We need to fix it. Again, this conversation is just so critically important.
That was one of our questions that was in the chat, is how do we support the families? Why they're trying to support their loved ones who are affected by that trauma. As you said, all our panelists said, it's difficult for the parents or the family members' needs to be addressed. So what can we do about supporting them as they're trying to support their loved one?
Well, some of the things, if I could jump in on that one, again, in our most recent annual report, we actually spend quite a bit of time focused on sort of the systems, how the system sort of treats families and what needs to be done. And, it goes back to this whole idea of sort of, not re-traumatizing families. But we list a whole bunch of things in our report about what we should be doing, everything from, engaging families more, like residential providers should be engaging families. They should have family members on their boards. They should allow for more transparency, more visitation. There's a whole bunch of things we can do, steps that can be taken to make this much more family-friendly system, which is, in our view, not just good for the family and the individual, it's also good for the system. The family members are a tremendous resource that are too often pushed aside and rather than being tapped into. So I think there's a lot we can do, but I think, and again, I'm not an expert in this by any means. My training in trauma-informed care comes from being a family member more than anything, but I think we need to be trained. We need to be more sensitive. We need to be able to identify the trauma. We need to be able to understand the trauma. And again, going back to Jill's point, not re-traumatizing, which is something we do all the time.
Yeah. And I think there just needs to be creativity in approach. I see that a lot with, across the board, no matter what the person's age is. I personally have a brother who has schizophrenia, and he's in his early 60s, and he has issues that impact him, and he is constantly in therapy, and he's getting assistance. But now my kid that's 30 may not be getting that assistance because he can't communicate. So I think it just needs to be addressed in a way that considers the entirety of the person's life, and there needs to be advocacy around it. There always needs to be someone that's advocating for our people, for sure. So,
And I think that somebody mentioned silos before, and I think that's part of it too, is you mentioned your brother. So access to mental health services for mental health issues, right? And I think we often get kind of that diagnostic overshadowing that somebody mentioned before, that you just say, oh, this must be related to their intellectual and developmental disability because they're having these behavioral outbursts, instead of saying what's going on, and this person needs access to mental health services. And I think that's, that ABA or behavioral planning is not a mental health treatment. I mean, I know ABA is effective for teaching skills to young children with autism. That's true. But it's not the answer to everything that comes up. And I think we get kind of tunnel vision often to think, oh, we've got a solution to people with IDD. And we don't think more broadly with that. And how do we get access to mental health treatment for folks?
yes.
I believe that there's also a piece here in this, the question about taking care of self, helping the parents. We tend to want to help everyone else. And the thing that I have learned in my lifetime is that if I don't take care of me, no one else is getting taken care of. It doesn't matter how much I try, my stuff always seems to get in the way. And so my advice to folks, and this is something I tell people regardless of what it is that we're talking about, is take care of yourself. By doing that, you put yourself in a better position to help others. If you're frazzled, things happen. Now, I train foster parents and resource parents all the time. And one of the questions comes up about what happened within the birth family. And I keep telling folks that 9 times out of 10, I've never met a birth parent who woke up in the morning and said, I'm just going to go beat my child. But something happens and it goes sideways. The discipline goes sideways. And babies and children get hurt, and adults too, for that matter. So please, if nothing else, take care of you so that you can actually do the hard work that you're talking about, so that you'll be around to do the hard work.
Very good point, for sure. Oh,
So-
yeah,
Eileen, I was just
sure.
going to follow up, respite care for the family and for our loved ones is always important. Going back to Dr. Hinton's comment about our loved ones who aren't verbal or have speech difficulties, many times they're shoved to the side because they can't describe what has happened to them. And the default is going to behavioral because it's difficult for them to communicate what the trauma was or what they're experiencing. How do we help those individuals? How do we get the professionals that we turn to try to see it's more than just behaviors? Is there anything hints that you can give the families to give those individuals assistance, since they can't traditionally talk to you or use the talk therapy that's been out there for everybody else?
I think, I mean, again, don't know your service system in terms of the access to supports, but I think helping to families to reframe how they're just, I mean, we all get kind of sucked into the way we describe things through the service system, the way IDD service systems have often described behaviors. But helping families kind of reframe that from, my child has experienced some emotional difficulties, or I'm seeing some mental health symptoms, something that's new for them, which, you know, again, if you were in a neurotypical, if you were working with somebody's neurotypical and all of a sudden they started doing something that was dangerous, you wouldn't say, we need to write a behavior program for them. You'd say, what happened? Like, what's happening with my friend that they're doing these things? And you would be seeking mental health services, and you'd be describing it probably in a different way. So maybe, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of ways to help families reframe how they're asking for help, to make the system respond in a different way. But the system also, like you all are doing, is trying to work with the system to also respond in a different way, to be curious about what's underlying this.
Yeah, I think that also there's a disparity in Medicaid services for individuals at all ages, right? So we have, you know, children that are at high risk that may not have wonderful insurance, and then they're not getting appropriate treatment. So that's another barrier, I think. So that's another, you know, in terms of having guidance for families, I think that's really important. Just I know that Perform Care, I think in the state of New Jersey addresses these kind of things with families or tries to, or local kayaks that we have. But I think that, we as Family Support Planning Council members and we're living it, we're all parents and we've all seen it. So we try to assist people. But I think it's important to have, kind of there needs to be resource information that's available that's just very specific and easy to, get through for folks. So I think to Gabrielle's point, she was saying, is there something that you can recommend in your work? How do you, advise families to get what they need, kind of a thing?
If I could just, I'm sorry, if I could just jump in. I think that we have to, when we talk about families, we look at it in terms of making the resources available and services more accessible and all that. But it's also, I really want to just emphasize this point, it's how we treat people, how we treat families. We got to stop dismissing people and disregarding people. We need to engage people and bring them into the conversation. It's just, it's like an attitudinal thing that I see, not with everyone, obviously, but, with some providers, with some government officials, we need to just be more sensitive to the way we treat people. I think because that would go a long way towards sort of, decreasing the amount of trauma that's inflicted on the individuals and their families.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Dinah, do you have a comment?
Well, I just have a question for Dr. Hinton. We've all had situations where you see the behavior and someone's falling apart. Can you give us, brief advice on how to address it, especially with someone who doesn't know how to verbalize what's upsetting them, so that we don't make some of the bad, frustrating responses that we shouldn't be making?
So yeah, this is a whole training, but so when we think about, I'll go back to kind of Bruce Perry, but he talks about, when we think about how the brain's reacting, if you think about how that person, what part of their brain they're responding from at that moment when they're really upset, they're dysregulated, something's going on, they're responding from that lowest part of their brain. So our response to them has to meet them right there, right? So they're dysregulated. So what we tend to want to do is to go in and take control, right? We tend to want to stop this behavior, and certainly safety comes into play. You're not going to let somebody seriously hurt themselves. But I think we have to match whoever's in the room with them, whoever's there has to match where they are. So when I'm with somebody who is really escalated, my approach is to usually give people as much space as possible, but to begin to do my own self-regulation, right? So taking deep breaths, seeing if they're noticing you doing some of those things. So match kind of where they are. So your first part, Bruce Perry has this great triangle, which is on the bottom is regulate, and the next part is relate, and the top part is reason. So when somebody's in that part of dysregulation, our only goal is to help them regulate. That's through deep breathing. That's through knowing them ahead of time too. That's the other thing I think that crisis response is really more about crisis prevention and getting to know somebody and understanding some of what their triggers are and how they typically respond when they're stressed or upset. So some of that deep breathing, knowing that that person is comforted by, I don't know, a stuffed animal, whatever, whatever that person, we're all about regulation and comfort at that point. So trying to really approach it from that perspective, as opposed to what our inclination often is to, take control. And if you think about that, this is where I kind of go back to some of those behavior plans. The other thing that sometimes happens is somebody tries to remind somebody about their behavior plan. Like if, you're going to get something at the end of the week if you do this. Well, remember where we talked about the person was operating from their brain at that point? They're not thinking about tomorrow or the next hour or even the next 10 minutes. They're right there in that moment. So, our response has to be where they are, and there's lots of strategies around grounding and getting people to kind of relax their body and do things. So I think helping to train direct support professionals in some of these more grounding techniques and getting away from kind of I gotta take control. And it helps them, it helps all of us. And, when I'm in that situation and I do that, it also calms me down, right? Because we don't want to match their level of anxiety. We want to bring in a lower level of anxiety. So there's lots of those kind of strategies that I think thinking about how you train direct support professionals is really key to this too. And working with families, obviously, in some of those better responses to escalation that can help people to calm. And then you're going to debrief around that so that you learn from that experience. So that, again, our goal in our START programs is really the prevention part, right? We're trying to figure out how do we modify environments, build strengths, do things preventively so that people don't get to that point in the future.
So I was just going to comment when we were talking about tools and just mention that the New Jersey's Community of Practice, which is a collaboration of the Council of Developmental Disabilities, members from the Division of Developmental Disabilities, and the Bog Center, we're working on what's called Charting the Life Course tools and trying to get that into the hands of support providers and eventually out to schools and others to try to think of our loved ones more holistically, thinking about their whole life and where they want to go and what they want to do and what they've experienced in order to get a better service plan. So hoping to get that out soon and try to spread the word so that families can start, when they sit down and start talking to a support provider, a school, or anybody who's going to give services, that they start thinking of where their child is now, their adult child or their minor child now, and where they're going, and trying to just start reaching at, let's look at this holistically so that the services can be provided more effectively to our loved ones.
Good point, Gabrielle, for sure. So I'm just checking out some of the comments in the chat here. So I have, there's a comment here that I found that self-care as a parent wasn't possible when my son and I were living from one crisis to another without the appropriate supports, which is something that I think we have all felt over time. So that just lends itself to what Paul and Jill and David, we've all been saying, that, we need to focus on supports for the family so that they can guide the loved one through the crisis. So I don't know if anybody has any further comments on that. I happen to just see that.
I think my only comment is we have spent so long thinking about this in terms of the children.
Yeah.
Just a reminder that children don't exist outside of the context of family. So if you're not dealing with the entire unit, I think we miss the mark. We have to deal with families. And I think that that's another place where systems go awry. We want to focus on what we think. And for some reason, we think we have this ability to be innovative and do all kinds of other things. State systems aren't designed to be innovative. They're designed to be reactive to things and bring things to scale. And if we stuck to that and allowed the community to do the innovation, I think we'd be in a much better place. But that's also true of funders. So
yeah, well, that's what we're doing with the Charting the Life Course Ambassador program in New Jersey, and DDD is heavily involved, and we're trying to get SPAN, and we're trying to get a whole group of people together to focus on that holistic. And Dave, your office is going to be great with that as well, and same with Paul. So we're all working towards it, right? We have a question here. What about schools too? Districts having healing centered departments providing supports, resources from pre-K through transition for families, students, and educators. So healing centered this sounds fabulous. I'm not sure what districts are doing that, but that really.
Well, I am aware because I'm involved with it. There is a 27 school pilot that's happening now across the state that will, a 27 district pilot.
Nice.
We are expanding that to, I think, and I may be wrong on this. I don't know if we're expanding to 50 or if we're adding 50, but somehow the 50 plays into this.
Mhm.
And it is a healing centered. It looks at not only adverse childhood experiences and healing centered, but it also focuses on mental health. And so all of those schools go through, and when I say all of those schools, I'm talking about all of the people, the staff, educators within those schools go through a number of different trainings. There are coaches that are there that are tied to the professionals, trying to make sure. So it is a pilot. It will be expanding. I'm pretty sure there will be a request for proposals that comes out soon. And I'll have to figure out where that comes from. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that that's a piece that's sitting there. And I know that in JEA, the State Teachers Union is also focusing on healing centered as a part of their platform. It's hard to find a union that's bargaining for the common good. They are moving more to bargaining for things like housing, access to services, rather than what's my next pay increase or increasing my benefits. They are understanding that they are tied to the community.
May I make a comment about the trauma-informed care in the schools question?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's so important what Dave was saying about taking all of the different resources that might be in the state and really connecting them. Because I know in Belleville Public Schools, there's actually an initiative too. I don't think it's part of the pilot. It's actually something from my school, Kane University. Someone's actually doing, we've been doing research projects related to trauma-informed care for school psychologists, and it's emerged into this applied program. So it's going to be kind of a trauma-informed care video, like a training. Everyone in the school will watch. There's going to be, in response to that, specific professional developments for really everyone in the school. So not just teachers, but as Dave was saying, coaches, et cetera. So everyone can kind of, get to that recognition, that understanding of trauma, and again, trying to not re-traumatize some of the students. And there's also going to be kind of community-based discussions. So we're including not just the faculty, but also, the families, the students themselves, trying to do this in a very culturally competent way. And it's kind of this pilot program in Belleville, but I know this is something that we've been working on. It'd be great to hear. I didn't know about the 27 other schools that are doing this. So it's great to be here to hear about this and be able to make those connections.
That's great, Dominique. Thank you for that. That's really. So there's a question here, child with 2E, very gifted and talented, very traumatic with a lot of behavioral issues. What is being done to address, right?
What resources are there for somebody with who is classified as gifted and talented, but they also have trauma or behavior issues at that end. What resources are available for that? I've found that, a lot of times that in the school districts, children who are considered gifted get dismissed. They could figure it out on their own. And it's hard to find resources to help them. And they already have their own issues of, being singled out as they go through the school system because they're gifted. They should know better.
Yeah, we just have a clarification, Gabrielle. So this person that's gifted also has been diagnosed with autism, ADHD, anxiety. So that's just another added layer. So it is a person that, I guess is savant, maybe, right?
Well, no, I guess it's again, some of our children with autism are classified as being gifted and talented in the school systems as well. So it's a compounding factor.
I talked a little bit previously about executive functioning, and I think trying to help people that are supporting folks with that have autism, who also have a lot of good cognitive skills and academic skills is trying to walk through that executive functioning part, because that's often what is causing the difficulty, is this mismatch. People, like you say, from externally see an academically gifted person, and they're like, why can't they problem solve around this, right? Now, why can't they figure this out? So I think really education around what does it mean to have autism? What does anxiety do to your brain too, right? So we talked about executive functioning. Anxiety is going to reduce that. So while you still may be able to do your schoolwork, you're struggling with how to problem solve, deal with things that are confusing, figure out what to do when something unexpected happens, those things that happen in schools all the time. Is trying to, I think, educate around that executive functioning and what are the supports that need to support the executive functioning. So they may not need supports around specific academic topics, but supports around that executive functioning. How do you go from class to class? I mean, that takes a lot of executive functioning in a school where there's all kinds of stuff happening around you. So I think, from a trauma-informed perspective and also from just understanding that role of executive functioning in folks who have kind of complex presentations.
Interesting. Okay, so do we have any other comments or questions?
So,
No?
well, with families that I've been working with, as a comment, is that the transition from moving from school, where everything is so laid out for a person. This is from 7:30 to 3:30. This is their day. This is what they do. Now, all of a sudden, they're now in the adult world, and it's difficult to navigate because the routine is disrupted. And that's when the stress and the anxiety, the familiarity of this is the classroom I've been in for the past 4 or 5 years, that's gone. And they're having issues moving over into the adult service world, which is totally different and structured differently. I think that when we're transitioning the young adults over, it's something that we need to work with within the systems, whether it's Division of Vocational Services, Division of Developmental Disabilities, and the support providers within there, to understand that things are different and they're being processed differently by our individuals. And a lot of times it's also the family members, because you used to go to the school and everything was right there. Now they don't know what to do. So I think we need help to empower the parents and the caregivers to start asking questions and giving them the better guidance during that transition period into the adult world services. That's part of, I think, breaking down the silos that we've all been talking about.
And from our topic, it's really trauma-informed care, right? We're trying to prevent people from experiencing a great deal of anxiety and stress as they enter a new service system. So I think some of the things you mentioned about losing that routine is key. And one of the key parts of like helping somebody be more regulated who's experienced any type of trauma or stressful situations is that predictability, routine, kind of rhythmic activities during your day. So I think, I mean, I'm not giving you an answer except to say that I think we all struggle, a lot of systems struggle with this, is how do you keep that predictability routine for folks where that's so important to their well-being as they graduate and go from one system to another. It is critical.
Just to build on that also, the transition, it can be traumatic, right? That whole transition can be. And so the question is, what can we, those of us who work in the system, do to ease that transition, to make it easier? Not just the transition from school to let's say an adult program, but the transition, from pediatrician to an adult doctor to, all the elements that go hand in hand. We need to make it easier. And I think that it's a great example of an opportunity for us to jump on. Yeah, again, there's so many, I'm listening to this conversation, and again, it's great that we're having it. It's just, again, just even recognizing the trauma associated with disability, I think, is a huge step forward, because it expresses itself, throughout the life of the individual, again, for that individual, as well as for every family member. And, just recognizing and learning how to work with families and individuals better, I think will benefit everybody.
Right. So we have a comment. Anne, do you want to speak to this, or would you like me to just convey this? Okay, so we have within Family Support Planning Council at the statewide level, we have the Health and Safety Subcommittee that focuses on person-centered thinking and training for direct support staff. So this just is speaking, it goes along with what we were already saying in terms of the training. So the person-centered training, if we're really focusing on the individual and the individual person-centered training, then if that person is having a mental health issue, we should be aware of that and be able to address that. So, and so that just to add to that point. But thank you for that comment, Anne. I don't know if you want to build on that at all, but basically it's something that mental health totally goes along with health and safety as well, with all of our individuals, and especially with regarding transition, regarding, change in lifestyles, changing in living arrangement, all of these things just compound their well-being. So we
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's Ann. I couldn't unmute quick enough, Eileen. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
good. You'll do a better job with it, Anne. Thank you.
I'm here.
Great.
I took person-centered thinking and training in 2006 when my son transitioned out of the education system. And it totally opened my eyes to looking at everyone differently, not just Joe, but looking at everyone differently. We have to focus on who someone is, not what they do, not what we're seeing, not what they look like, not how they present. And so when we started this health and safety committee and started talking about training for direct support staff, the person-centered thinking just came to the forefront for all of us that are on the subcommittee. And both Dave and Jill addressed this when we're seeing someone present with a behavior that we're not used to. And looking at it and looking at it from, they're trying to communicate something, because that's what I learned in person-centered thinking and planning. When you see someone doing something that you've never seen before, that is different from something you've ever seen before, they're trying to tell you something from that behavior. And all of the the discussions that Dave and Jill were just saying just reinforced that for me, and reinforced it for me in our health and safety subcommittee. But most importantly, we could do all the training we want. We can do training on person-centered thinking, training on ACEs. But unless people see our loved ones as equal citizens, the training isn't going to matter. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that it's not going to matter. It might not click with everyone. Our loved ones have to be seen as equal citizens. And Dave, you touched on that about looking at people. A parent doesn't wake up one day and say, "I'm going to beat my kid today." So we need to look at those parents. Those parents are our equals too. Our loved ones are equals. We're all in this together. And until our loved ones are seen as equals, I don't think things are going to change as much as we want them to.
Yep. Good point, Anne. Thank you. That's really good. And it's so true. So, okay.
So I'm looking at that question that's in there. The Office of Resilience doesn't have an age. We're here to support people across the state of New Jersey. Yeah, we talk about trauma at an early age, but we talk about it in terms of the life course and the implications across the life course. Because oftentimes when trauma happens, it may not show up until we're 30, 35, in my case, 70. I don't know. It shows up when it shows up. And so, yes, I'm there. My office is there for anyone in the state of New Jersey. In fact, like I said, we get calls from all over, actually all over the world. We're being asked to help people figure out how to do stuff, because what we're doing here, I guess I should say there, since I'm in Arizona, what we're doing there isn't being done anywhere else in the world. Not the way we're doing it, by engaging with community. And on that note, even in the very near future, I will be looking for community people to train how to do the presentations around ACEs that we do. And it's a very limited thing. We do have an application process. There will be 30 slots, and it will be free of charge. It'll be an opportunity for parents and others to get trained to do these presentations, to take a deeper dive into understanding ACEs. The challenge to you will be to help us figure out how to make the language fit the mental health community, right? So we like to customize it for the different groups that we're working with. And I don't know the language well enough to make it fit, but you do. I can teach you the presentation. I can't teach your knowledge. You will bring in a unique perspective. And I just want to put that out there. It's probably going to be closer to the first part of December. And I know you'll say, please let us know. And I'm a person, one person, and I can guarantee you my memory is not that good.
We'll reach out to you, Dave, for sure. I'm sure
There you go.
we have so many wonderful advocates within our network at Family Support Planning Council. I'm sure that you'll get a lot of interest with this. So we can definitely publish something, Kyoko, right? We'll definitely get the word out for sure. We're getting toward time to wrap up. Do you have any final comments, Paul, or Jill? Just any final comments before we close?
No final comments. But again, I think most people in this meeting know how to reach us, but feel free to, reach out to myself, Christine, anytime we can help with the issues we're discussing today, as well as any other issues that you and your family might be facing.
Thank you, Paul.
I'll just say it's been really, really good discussion. And again, I'm glad there's some, at the broader system level, there's work being done. And I think, as Dave said, you all will help translate that for the IDD community, to make sure that people with IDD are included in this, make sure they're included in this trauma-informed approach. And more than that you all will continue to work to make sure it impacts the policies, practices, and services, because that's where it's got to be holistic, and include that perspective of families and individuals. So yeah, it's exciting to have this conversation. I will just mention really quickly, and I can send this to you all too, that I am with the Center for START Services, and we do work with states around implementing the model, but the Center for START Services also provides national web-based trainings. And there is a DSP course, I think, starting in November, that you might, if you want to send out some of your providers to see if they wanted to send DSPs. And it's definitely from a strength-based, positive psychology, trauma-informed approach of helping people with DSPs understand mental health aspects of people with IDD.
That would be great. Yeah, if you could send that to Kyoko, and then we'll
Okay.
Jill, so thanks so much.
You're welcome.
We appreciate your time and your knowledge. And this is really great. And I just want to thank all of our speakers today. And I'm going to also clap, and now Gabrielle, sorry, Gabrielle does the closing, but I just want to thank everyone for your time on this lovely Saturday. And we're all clapping. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
No, again, thank you all for joining us this morning, especially our speakers, Dave, Jill, and Paul. And a special thank you, shout out goes to our regional council coordinator, Kyoko Koko, who makes this volunteer job so much easier for Eileen and me.
Right.
We appreciate all the behind the scenes work that she does always. I'm just hoping that this is the beginning of the discussion about the trauma issues, mental health, and our IDD population. I'm hoping that families and providers who are on the call today start looking at things a little more holistically, seeing how we can infuse a trauma-based approach when we're dealing with our family members and our families as a unit, and breaking down these silos between the state agencies, the schools, medical providers, and service providers, and help build a better system that we have so that our families can be stronger, and through that, our loved ones can be stronger. Just want to let everybody know the New Jersey Family Support Planning Council consists of 10 regional councils throughout the state of New Jersey. Our membership is all volunteers of individuals with developmental disabilities and their family members. Our goal is to create a bridge of information advocacy between families, providers, and state agencies. Please visit our website about more information about the statewide council and your regional councils. We have regional councils have monthly meetings. We are all on Zoom still. We are so looking forward to being in person at some point. So our next statewide meeting is November 20th. We hope you all can join us for that. I want to give a shout out to our Council 6, who on October 14th is hosting a discussion between Jonathan Seafried, who's the Assistant Commissioner of DDD, and Paul Aronsohn about services. You can find more information about that out on our website. Thank you again for joining us this morning. And again, thank you so much for our speakers for being here with us.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.